Christopher New. He's going to be talking about prostitution and prejudice, Hong Kong's colonial demimonde. So if you could note those two dates, perhaps of interest to you. But right now I'd like to welcome writer and entrepreneur Christopher Dillon. He's going to describe the process of actually buying a home in China. So we know all the machinations from the very macro point of view, but what about the micro? What is it like on the ground? Well, Christopher has lived in Hong Kong since 1992. In 2002, he bought and renovated a floor in an office building in Hong Kong's Central Business District. Since then, he's purchased and refurbished a luxury apartment on the west side of Hong Kong Island and transformed a derelict steam laundry into a multimedia studio, very 21st century. Most recently became a residential landlord in Tokyo, so he's got a lot of experience. But that experience inspired a lot of books as well about buying a home in Hong Kong and Japan. And now his latest book, called Landed China, published in March 2013. Please welcome Christopher Dillon.
Thank you very much, Angie. As Angie mentioned, today I'm going to tell you about the process of buying a home in China. My presentation is going to be a little bit unusual because I'm not in the real estate business, so I promise I'm not going to try and sell you anything. But I will tell you about the opportunities and some of the risks of buying a home in China and the quirks that make owning a property in China a little bit different than owning one elsewhere. As Angie mentioned, I became a property owner in 2002 when I bought a floor in a Hong Kong office building. And since then, I bought, sold, and rented commercial, residential, and industrial property in Hong Kong and in Tokyo. And I've also undertaken a couple of fairly interesting renovations, like this one here, that became the multimedia studio. I bought these properties as an outsider with a lot of questions and with even more skepticism. And my books are written from that perspective, as is the presentation that follows. So let's start with the most fundamental question of all: can I buy a home in China? Despite the recent market tightening measures, foreigners can still own a home in China. But you need to have lived in China legally for 1 year before you can buy. Under Circular 171, which was promulgated in 2006, foreigners can only own one property, and it has to be for your own use. You can't rent it out. People from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan are not considered to be foreigners under this regulation. And aside from properties near some government offices, there are no restrictions on the sort of property that you can buy. So, for example, you can buy something like a villa on a golf course, Andre. Under Circular 186, which was issued in 2010, foreign companies can also own property in China. But again, the property can only be for the company's own use. They can't rent it out. And it's possible to do like you do here in Hong Kong and use a company to buy, sell, and rent real estate in China. But frankly, it's such a bit of aggravation to do that most people don't find it worth the hassle because the company has got to be set up specifically for that purpose. Circular 171 and 186 are national regulations, and on top of those, there are city-based rules. For example, in Shanghai, you've got to produce tax receipts showing that you've lived in the city for 12 out of the past 24 months. And unmarried non-locals are prohibited from buying a home. In Beijing, you have to have paid local taxes and Social Security for 5 years before you can own. In addition to these restrictions on foreigners, there are also restrictions on locals. For example, there are limits on the number of properties that you can own. You have to make a larger down payment if you're buying a second home, and the interest rates on mortgages for second homes are higher. Beijing recently announced that single local people can only own one home. There are a million scams in China to get around these regulations because real estate is such an important part of the Chinese economy, including things like fake weddings and fake divorces. Marriage plays a central role in the process because the property ownership regulations are not based on the individual, they're based on the household unit. And marriage can be a way for a non-local person to get a residency permit or a hukou. Regulations change frequently, and right now we're in the midst of a tightening phase. But it wasn't always like this. Back in the 1990s, in Shanghai, if you bought a property, you could actually get a hukou in what was then a very depressed residential property market. So now let's look at China's land policy. With a few exceptions, all urban land in China is owned by the state, and all rural land is owned by collectives. Individuals and companies are not allowed to own land in China. When you buy a home in China, you're buying the building or a share in the building and the right to use the land under the structure. Land for residential use is leased from the state for a period of 70 years, and the first land lease was actually signed in Shenzhen in 1987. Since then, no land leases have expired. Now, the central government has gone on record and committed that residential leases will be renewed when they do expire, but they have not explained the process for renewing those leases. They haven't explained how long the leases will be renewed for, and they haven't explained how much it's going to cost to renew them. Land for industrial use is leased for 50 years, while land for commercial use is leased for 40 years. Unlike residential land, commercial and industrial land is not covered by the automatic lease provisions that I mentioned a minute ago. Also, improvements to industrial or commercial land revert back to the state at the end of the lease. So if you put up a building, it actually goes back to the government when the lease is over. This is important because you will see individual apartments in Soho offices and also rooms in hotels marketed as investments, and these might appear to be residential, but in fact they're commercial and they're covered under the commercial regulations. In China, land is developed in two ways. The first is expropriation, which is also known as eminent domain, compulsory purchase, or if you're from Australia, resumption. And under expropriation, the state takes a home, compensates the owner, clears the land, and then leases the land to a developer. Sometimes homeowners are happy with this arrangement because they're resettled in new apartments with modern conveniences like indoor plumbing, but some people protest or refuse to leave their homes. Old low-density properties near the city center are often expropriated and replaced with profitable, high-density apartment buildings. And that's one of the reasons that many Chinese buyers prefer to buy new homes. They're less likely to be expropriated. The second method occurs when a collective converts farmland to urban use. And when this happens, the farmer sells his land use rights to the collective, which in turn sells them on to a developer. Individual farmers can't sell their land to developers, and the farmers only receive a small fraction of the proceeds of the sale, and sometimes that leads to social unrest. Usually, this process works pretty well, but not always. For example, there are no less than 79 residential complexes on the outskirts of Beijing that are built on rural land, and homes in these complexes sell at a discount because they have impaired land use rights. The conversion from rural to urban land has created a uniquely Chinese development called the urban village. Now, as cities grew, they absorbed neighboring villages, which were classified as rural land. The villages had two parts. There was farmland and fields, and there was also houses and other buildings. The cities bought the farmland and converted that into urban land, but in many cases, they didn't buy the buildings. And those buildings and the land that was underneath them became urban villages, which are little oases of rural land owned by collectives, and they are still governed by rural regulations. Urban villages are especially common in southern China. In 2005, there were more than 300 in Shenzhen alone. Guangzhou has over 130, including Xipai, which is shown here. The residents of urban villages, the residents of urban villages make a tidy living renting rooms to migrant workers, and in some villages, the ratio of migrants to locals is 30-1. You don't want to live near an urban village because they're fire traps, they're hotbeds of crime ranging from prostitution to drug dealing and burglary. And the security camera that you can see here and the iron grates over the windows and the balconies are not at all unusual. Urban villages are very commonly in the center of the city, and Xipai is about a kilometer from one of Guangzhou's most prestigious and expensive shopping centers that you can see here. So now let's look at China's housing stock, and that can be broadly divided into three categories. The first group is homes that were built before the revolution in 1949, and in Beijing this includes Sihuan or courtyard homes. In Guangzhou, you've got Keilao shop houses, which are notable for their covered shopping arcades that protect you from the sun and the rain in Guangzhou. Guangzhou also has Xiguan houses like this one and Western villas particularly in places like Shamian Island. Shanghai has Lilong townhouses and some of the world's best Art Deco buildings, like Broadway Mansions Hotel near the Bund. Shenzhen, on the other hand, saw its population jump from 30,000 in 1979 to about 13 million last year. So as a result, there's very, very little in the way of old housing stock in Shenzhen. Pre-1949 homes can be spectacular, but renovating them is not for the faint of heart. The ownership structure can be complex because properties were often subdivided to accommodate multiple families, and it can be really difficult to find and negotiate a settlement with all of the people who have a claim on the land use rights. Renovations also can be very expensive. It can cost you upwards of 70,000 yuan per square meter. And deferred maintenance means that some of these places are in pretty grim condition. Also, many of the Sihuan, for example, don't have indoor plumbing, so if you want to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, you've got to put your shoes on and walk down the block. Old homes like these Lilong in Shanghai also tend to be near the city center, which makes them expensive and also prone to expropriation. The second category is homes built between 1949 and the end of the century. Unfortunately, most of these homes are simply not worth considering. After the revolution, the government's main concern was to house people quickly and inexpensively. Comfort and style were low priorities, and homes tended to be small, ugly, and poorly built. In addition, it's almost impossible to get a mortgage for a home that's more than 15 years old. The final group is homes erected after 2000, and the amenities, designs, and construction of these homes can be superb, especially in developments by top-tier builders. However, quality can still be an issue. You may have seen last month that builders in Shenzhen were discovering using untreated sea salt in the cement that they were using, and that causes major problems down the road because the chlorine and the salt in the sea sand actually rusts the rebar in the building and can lead to structural failure. New homes and other developments are sometimes built in old industrial zones, which are known as brownfield sites. And many of these are popular as development sites because they have city center locations. Shanghai's M50, for example, was once a collection of warehouses and factories, and the Expo 2010 site was also formerly the home of a shipyard, a power plant, and a steel company. Brownfield sites are often contaminated with petrochemicals, heavy metals, and persistent organic pollutants, and this has caused major problems throughout China. For example, a 2,400-unit Yangtze Pearl apartment complex in Wuhan was discovered to have been built on a contaminated site where a pharmaceutical plant had operated. This doesn't affect every new build in China, but it's certainly something that you might want to keep in mind. Now let's take a look at the process of actually buying a home. It's always a good idea to start with online research to learn what's available, the pricing, and generally how the market works. The more background and the more information you have before you put your boots on and start walking, the more likely you are to be successful. When you've identified a potential home, investigate the neighborhoods and things like road noise. And look into the building and developer. You wouldn't want to live next door to a graveyard or in a building that was the site of a murder or a suicide. Another famous example of a place you wouldn't want to live next to is Lotus Riverside in Shanghai, which fell over in 2009 because it had been built with hollow pilings. It's since been renamed, by the way. I'm a big believer in scouting neighborhoods on foot because it's a great way to discover opportunities, problems, and the location of the nearest card game. When you found an area you like, visit at different times of the day and on weekends to ensure that you get a full picture of your new neighborhood, because neighborhoods do change depending on the time of day and the day of the week. You might even try commuting to your new office to see if that works. Also, China's infrastructure is being built out at a frantic rate, so you should check your neighborhood to make sure that it's not going to be the site of a new train line or other major development. Very often you can't do anything about these developments, but you should factor them into your buying decision at the very least. If possible, find a real estate agent who's used to working with expats. It'll make communications easier, and it'll also increase the likelihood that you find a place that suits you. A classic example is kitchens tend to be enclosed both here in Hong Kong and in China because servants work in kitchens, whereas Westerners, we like to entertain in them. So it's those sorts of things that if you can save yourself the trouble of explaining it to a real estate agent, you'll make your life easier. If you do buy a home, the sale and purchase agreement will almost certainly be in Chinese. Chinese courts will enforce a contract that's not in Chinese, but most local vendors won't sign one. And Chinese contracts take precedence over foreign language ones unless the Chinese contract specifically and explicitly states that the foreign language version takes precedence. You should expect to pay at least 30% of the purchase price as a down payment, and there's no escrow in China, so it's not unusual to hand over a brick of 100 yuan notes to the owner or to a real estate agent acting on your behalf. And while some cities have computerized land registry systems, a national registry doesn't exist yet. One is planned, though, as a precursor for the national property tax that's expected to be put in place by June 2014. Speaking of taxes, you'll pay a deed tax of 3% to 5% of the property's value, and deed taxes are lower for smaller, less expensive homes, which are called ordinary homes, which are built for workers. You'll also pay the real estate agent's commission, which ranges from 0.5% to 3%, with the actual price depending on the value of the home, its location, and your negotiating skills. If you're not a Chinese national, you'll need to pay to have your signature notarized, and that costs 0.25% of the property's price. It's not at all unusual to have the vendor make the buyer pay commissions and taxes or to bury them in the asking price. In Shanghai and Chongqing, you will pay an annual property taxes, and there is a range of other taxes and surcharge, but these are relatively minor. They're not big ticket items. When you sell your home, you'll pay a 5% tax on the appreciation of the property, and this is waived if you've owned the property for more than 5 years. Last month, the central government announced that it would begin enforcing an existing 20% tax on capital gains from the sale of second homes. If the purchase price of your home is not known, you can opt to pay a 1% tax on the total sale proceeds instead of the 20% capital gains tax. If you buy a new home from a developer, you don't have to pay commission to the real estate agent. And that's one of the attractions of buying a new home. Another is that the developer should have resolved any outstanding title issues. You'll get the full 70-year land lease, and new homes generally have fewer problems with building quality. Your new home will probably be handed over to you as a bare shell, and some developers offer decoration services, but this is by no means universal. Many buyers like bare shells because they're cheaper to buy, they deteriorate less if the home is being left empty as an investment, and they're easier to sell. But as you can see from this bathroom, bare shells are very bare indeed. And finding a contractor who can meet your schedule, budget, and quality expectations, and managing the decoration process is a challenge in any market, and China is by no means an exception in this regard. Whether you buy new or used, mortgages are available from local, Hong Kong, and international lenders. China's mortgage market is heavily regulated, and yuan-denominated loans are effectively commodity items with lending rates and regulations set by the People's Bank of China. International and Hong Kong banks have an edge in terms of customer service and their ability to offer foreign currency loans. Typically, they also offer literature and information in English, which you may find harder to obtain from a Chinese bank. The foreign currency loans can also be attractive if you believe that the yuan is going to continue to appreciate. Developers generally don't offer financing, but they usually have a relationship with a bank that's financing the construction process, and that can sometimes speed up the application process, but you won't get a better deal on the mortgage. And while mortgages are available, a surprising number of homes are still purchased with bricks of 100 yuan notes. Research by CLSA showed that in 2011, 1/3 of all buyers paid cash for their homes, up from 24% in 2007. For investment properties like this apartment, 53% paid cash in 2011. And that brings me to the final part of my presentation, and arguably the most critical question of all: is there a bubble? And I think the question is a qualified yes. Prime real estate in China's Tier 1 cities, Beijing, Guangzhou, Shanghai, and Shenzhen, is undoubtedly expensive. And despite the central government's market cooling measures, prices continue to rise. In March 2013, prices in 100 major cities increased by 3.9% year on year. Homes in prime locations are now equal to, and in some cases more expensive than those in New York, Hong Kong, or London. Prices have risen with China's growing wealth, but they're also driven by a lack of alternatives. Low interest rates, lack of access to international markets, and other factors make cash, stocks, and bonds relatively unattractive to domestic investors. Real estate often wins by default, even if properties are left unoccupied and decaying, like this villa. While property prices are high, I don't think we're going to see an American subprime style crash. That's because loan to valuation ratios remain low and there's very strong demand from upgraders. Research by the Brookings Institution shows that nearly 1/3 of China's 225 million urban homes do not have a private kitchen or a private bathroom. And the State Council recently predicted that by 2030, nearly 2/3 of China's population will live in cities, up from about 50% today. That's 300 million more than in 2012, roughly the population of the United States. Furthermore, China's new leadership is committed to socialism with Chinese characteristics, making it highly unlikely that we're going to see a return to the day when housing was provided by the Danwei or work unit. If you're planning on living in China, buying a home can make sense, but only if you're going to be in China for the medium to long term, if your personal and financial situations are relatively stable and you're aware of the risks. I wouldn't expect the dramatic price gains that we've seen over the past decade, and I would prepare for volatility, whether that's from policy and regulatory changes, a global recession, a geopolitical event, or a black swan. And now I'll answer your questions. Thank you.
If you could raise your hands and I'll, Chris, maybe you could start off with answering one of my questions. Why do so many Chinese homeowners leave their property investments empty?
There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the yields, the rental yields on property, are so low that the cost of actually fitting out the apartment, in contrast with the amount of money that you make from rental yield, the numbers just simply don't work. And this also speaks to the idea of real estate as a store of wealth. It's much easier to sell that empty flat onward to somebody else. They don't have to rip out your decorations. So that's one of the main reasons.
How do you think about nowadays in China and our growth city? Nobody living there.
So, sorry.
It's not now.
That's okay. The question was, what do I think of the ghost cities like Erdos and places like that? In any real estate development process, there's a speculative element. In Canada, in Australia, in the United States, in the UK, a developer takes a punt and says he's going to build something in the hope that the area, Canary Wharf being, I guess, a prime example in London, that the city will move out to encompass it and it will make sense by the time it's built. You see the same thing in China, but with greater inefficiency because it's still, in many ways, a centrally planned economy. So you are going to see more overhang like that. I think it's completely natural, and it will take a little bit of time, but all of that will be taken up. If you have seen some of the places like the urban villages and you see the way people live, moving out of the center of the city into a new town, but in a place that's got proper glazing on the windows, that the wind doesn't whistle through at -30 in the wintertime, that's got indoor plumbing, you might be more willing to consider something like that. Whereas a lot of Westerners, they go to a place like Shanghai and they see the Lilong and they think, oh wow, this is so romantic. Or they see the Sihuan in Beijing and think the same thing. But if you are living there and you want quality of life, you might have a different sort of view of that.
My name is Susan Liang. I'm a lawyer in Hong Kong.
Yes.
I just want to ask you regarding the status of the purchaser.
Mm-hmm.
If the purchaser is a married person and buys a property, I understand that before the property, when the property is sold, even you buy it in your own name, but you're a married person, you didn't put it in joint names of your wife, you still need your wife's consent to sell it. Is that right?
Yeah, and what you will end up doing is going and making a formal declaration that you are unmarried or single. Yes, so yes, it is. It's based on the household, and yes, it can get very complicated.
Surely you cannot just go along to a notary and just declare you're single if you're really married.
Nobody would do that.
I think you may have to produce a divorce certificate. Or something like that. So this is one of the pitfalls of buying China property if you're a married person.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. You will be asked to validate your marital status, or you may very well be asked. But one of the other challenges to buying property in China is that the laws and the regulations are not uniformly enforced. And trying to get definitive answers when I was writing the book, saying, is this the case, is very, very difficult, because it depends who you ask and what time of day you ask them.
Well, and also which county it is. I mean,
Very much.
town by town it changes. But I'm curious that you've come into this from a crisis management point of view, so put you to the test. Why on page 65 do you say the monthly cost is 118,000 renminbi for a mortgage?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Page 65 of your book,
Uh-huh.
there's a figure that mentions 118,000 renminbi as the monthly cost for running a mortgage.
What that is just a sample calculation for that property.
It would have nothing to do with that the deed tax is also 118,000. Okay, you can get back to me later.
I'll get a copy of the book out later. The calculations that Marty is referring to are just sample purchase transaction prices. And there are a couple for a new, there's one for a new home in the book, and then there's one for an existing home.
You know, Susan brought up a great point. This kind of lack of consistency, really, doesn't that detract from even the desire to buy a home in China?
A great question. It's the store of wealth thing. If you are Chinese, you have a very limited number of places that you can put your money, and real estate becomes the dog with the fewest fleas, basically. So you accept that going forward. The other reality is that if you want transparency and stability and security, buy in Hong Kong. You know, because that is one of Hong Kong's traditional advantages, is that we've got rule of law. You can see a contract written in English. You know that the contract is defensible. You can take somebody to court over it. And this is not to speak ill of China, but in any developing market, there is usually a gap between the opportunity, which is higher, and then the legal infrastructure and your ability to enforce that contract. And that's just one of the risks that you take when you invest in an emerging market.
Hang on, it's working. Chris, just quickly, with the recent restrictions, do you think these will ease off, or can we look forward to more of them?
You can look forward to more of them, almost certainly. There was research by a Dutch university that did research into attitudes, a study into attitudes of Chinese buyers, and what they discovered was that the sample that they used, the buyers found that when new restrictions were put in, they saw that as a buying opportunity, because the feeling was as soon as the restrictions were lifted, there was going to be a huge amount of unmet demand, and people would be scrambling to buy more. It's one of the things that if you own property here, it makes it really, really difficult, because if you are a property owner in Hong Kong, you're thinking in terms of yield, you're thinking in terms of capital gain, you're using fairly logical, what we think of as fairly logical, rational measures of the process. And if you're a buyer in China, you're not using the same measures. And if you're a Chinese buyer buying in Hong Kong, it's the same thing. Your objectives, yes, you'd like to get yield, yes, you'd like to get capital gains, but preserving your wealth is far and away the most important consideration.
I saw a question up here. Please, thank you.
Thank you. Did you come across any data on how many foreigners have actually bought property in China?
No, I didn't. Interesting little tidbit, though, that will give you some perspective on that. In 2011, there was a survey that was done in Beijing. Just over 1% of the population was born outside of China. In 2010, there was a survey done in London, and 27% of the population of London was born outside of the UK. And in 2000, a survey was done in New York City, and it was 37% of the population of New York City was born outside the United States. I would not for a minute pretend that Beijing is going to turn into New York City and invite in your huddled masses yearning to be free. But as China opens up to the world, as more multinational companies do business in China, I think you're going to see a much greater population of foreigners living, not just in the tier 1 cities, but in the other cities as well.
Hi, Chris.
Yes.
I'm just wondering, is it worth looking at or exploring, having a local Chinese company as a holding vehicle for property investments for foreigners?
The short answer is no. One of the really interesting parts that I came across writing the book is that you talk to old China hands, and then you talk to lawyers who specialize in things, and the lawyers will tell you you should do X, Y, and Z and follow it by the book. And the old China hands will look at you and roll their eyes in opposite directions and say, "You idiot! Nobody does that." But the reality is that the government in China is tightening things up. And a lot of the old wheezes that you could get away with are becoming less and less practical. As a foreigner, you are also very easy to be used as an example. So for example, if I'm a Chinese buyer and one of the enforcement or regulatory bodies comes around and sees that I've done something naughty, that person, if they're politically savvy, will try and find out who my father is, who I'm married to, how much juice I've got. If you're a foreigner, on the other hand, you have no juice. So if somebody's looking to make an example out of you, it's pretty easy to do that. So my advice is be whiter than white, be Caesar's wife, dot all the I's, cross all the T's. It'll stand you in good stead, because where you may be able to buy, for example, trying to repatriate your money is already difficult now. I mean, if you try and get money out, it's a 3-step process. You've got to show the sale and purchase agreements, you've got to show where the money came from to buy it originally, you've got to show that you paid all of the taxes, and then you've got to apply to SAFE to get the money out. So adding to something that's already a complicated, bureaucratic, and cumbersome process, the prospect of having to explain that you didn't actually follow the rules the way you were supposed to, you'd have to have an appetite for trouble.
What about the appetite for clean air? You talk about this as China grows, more multinationals coming in, probably the influx of foreigners, but we're also hearing a lot of expats leaving Beijing because of just the extraordinarily toxic air.
It's a major, major concern, and it's not just Beijing. I mean, all of China's cities have got issues with water pollution, with air pollution, and with soil pollution is another big one. There are city parks in Beijing that are heavily contaminated with lead, other heavy metals. And if you had a child in the house, and as somebody's, you have a kid going around putting stuff in their mouth, that's very frightening stuff. That being said, I have confidence in the Chinese authorities. They're extremely pragmatic people. They are painfully aware of the fact that this is going on. And this isn't just a problem with foreigners. This is a problem for anybody who's alive. They have a tough balancing act that they've got to accomplish between economic growth, social stability, and the environment. They're aware of it. They're addressing it. I don't think it's going to be resolved tomorrow, but I do think that it's very high on their list of priorities. Would I want to live there and breathe it? Probably not.
It's a quick question having to do with ethnicity. Gentleman over in the first row is ethnic Chinese. I am not. My fiance is ethnic Chinese. She has different stars on her Hong Kong identity.
Right.
Okay? So there's an exquisite, polite form of racism, obviously. And so does this gentleman over here and I have a different role? Is he considered a foreigner at the same level as myself as a foreigner? Or are we all treated as foreigners if we're not citizens of the PO?
Now, I'm assuming that this gentleman is actually, just for the sake of your question, which is a good one, I will assume that this gentleman is Hong Kong born and bred and has got a Hong Kong ID card, as opposed to somebody who's was born in Australia or Canada and moved back here and carries a Canadian passport. Okay. So if that is the case, this gentleman is considered to be a good Chinese patriot. I have yet to be able to get a satisfactory answer as to how permanent residents of Hong Kong who are not ethnically Chinese are treated.